November 1948. A bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Howard Hughes is 43 years old. He's owned RKO Pictures for 6 months, and he runs it from a hotel room because Howard Hughes doesn't go to offices. On the table in front of him is a legal agreement. 6 months ago, the United States Supreme Court ruled 7-1 that the biggest movie companies in America had been running an illegal monopoly. For 35 years, 5 studios owned the production lots. They owned the distribution networks, and they owned the movie theaters, which meant they decided what got made, who starred in it, and where you watched it. If you wanted to show a Paramount movie in your town, you took Paramount's full lineup for the year, the hits and the garbage, and you took it as a package deal. The court killed that practice and sent the theater question, whether the studios could keep owning the buildings, back to a lower court for a fresh look. Hughes doesn't wait. He volunteers to split RKO Studio from its theater chain before the lower court even rules. He's the first domino. Paramount falls next, then Warner Brothers, then Fox. MGM holds out until 1957, but by then it's over. The system that decided what Americans watched on Saturday nights dies because a bored billionaire couldn't be bothered to fight for it. But what if he does? What if Hughes decides to fight? What if he holds his theaters and every studio head watching him decides to hold theirs? Let's hit CTRL+Z and rewrite history. Welcome to CTRL+Z Rewritten, the podcast where we take the biggest decisions in history and ask what happens if they go the other way. Not random what-ifs, real 50-50 calls with alternatives that were actually on the table. One decision, we hit CTRL+Z, try it the other way, and we see what changes. To understand what Hughes threw away, you have to understand what Hollywood looked like in 1948, because it looked nothing like it does now. 5 companies ran the American movie business: Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO. Each one owned a production studio where the films were made, a distribution operation that shipped the prints to theaters, and a chain of movie theaters where audiences actually watched them. Top to bottom, every step of the process, one company. But the theaters were the key. The 5 studios owned about 17% of the screens in the country, which sounds modest until you realize those were the big downtown palaces in every major city. They were the ones that got the movies first, and they charged premium prices and drew the Saturday night crowds. 17% of the buildings generated nearly half of all the ticket revenue in America. The system ran on a practice called block booking. Let's say you're an independent theater owner in 1945 and you want to show Casablanca. You can't just buy Casablanca. You have to buy Warner Brothers' entire lineup for the year, sight unseen, bundled together as a single package. Now, you would get Mildred Pierce, but you also had to take The Horn Blows at Midnight, which was a god-awful Jack Benny comedy about a trumpet-playing angel assigned to blow the last trumpet and end the world. The movie essentially ended any hopes of Jack Benny becoming a leading man in Hollywood. If you refuse the bundle, you lose the movie your audience came to see. This guaranteed every studio a market for everything it produced, good or bad, and it locked independent filmmakers out of the theaters entirely because every screen in the country was already committed to studio products before January. The Department of Justice sued the studios in 1938. The case dragged on for a decade through legal settlements and district court rulings and finally reached the Supreme Court in 1948. The ruling, written by Justice William O. Douglas for a 7-1 majority, is one of the most misunderstood decisions in American legal history. People remember it as the court ordering the studios to sell their theaters. But that didn't happen. The courts banned block booking and price fixing and struck down the deals that let studios lock independent theaters out of entire cities. But on the theater question itself, Douglas wrote something specific. owning a theater chain is not illegal by itself. It's only illegal if the studio is using that ownership to crush competition. The Supreme Court sent the case back down to the district court and told it to start fresh. Howard Hughes, who had owned RKO for all of 6 months and was already bored with it, gave the government what it wanted before the lower court even ruled. He volunteered to split the studio from the theaters, and in doing so, he showed every other executive in Hollywood that compliance was easier than fighting. Paramount signed next, then Warner, then Fox. MGM's Lowe's theater chain held out for 9 years and finally gave in by 1957. The dominoes fell in the direction Hughes pushed them. What came after was a different industry. Without guaranteed screens, studios stopped making 40 movies a year and started making 10. Without the revenue to support large payrolls, they let their contracted actors go. Talent agencies stepped in to fill that vacuum, packaging writers and directors and stars into deals that the agencies controlled. A producer with a good script and a bankable name could walk into any theater in America and negotiate for screen time that no studio had locked up. Independent production replaced the assembly line. And into the wreckage, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, walked a generation of film school graduates who had nowhere else to go and nothing to lose. The studios were broke. The old guard was gone. And nobody knew what audiences wanted anymore. So executives started handing out million-dollar budgets to unknown directors and telling them to figure it out. Francis Ford Coppola got the freedom to make The Godfather the way he wanted it. George Lucas convinced Fox to bankroll a sci-fi space opera called Star Wars. Martin Scorsese shot Taxi Driver on a shoestring budget, and Steven Spielberg turned Jaws into the first modern blockbuster. But none of that happens the same way at a studio that still owns its theaters. And television was killing the movie business on a separate schedule. 90 million Americans went to the movies every week in 1946. By 1960, that number was 40 million. Families were moving to the suburbs, away from the downtown palaces, and staying home in front of their television sets. That collapse was coming whether the studios owned the theaters or not. Those lawsuits didn't cause it. What they did was strip the studios of the one asset, their theater chains, that would have cushioned the fall. That's the real timeline. The system died, the gap opened, and everything Americans watch today, from the films of the 1970s to HBO to Netflix, was built in the space the studios left behind. But the Supreme Court left an opening. The lower court had instructions to take a fresh look at the theater question. If Hughes, instead of volunteering, had called his lawyers and said, "What happens if I hold?" the court would have faced a harder question. Does owning 17% of the nation's screens, with block booking already banned and price fixing already dead, actually constitute a monopoly? Under the standard the Supreme Court had laid down, the answer isn't obvious. Howard Hughes holds. His lawyers send word to the other studios. Nobody moves first. Without a signed agreement to wave around, the government has to walk into court and prove that 5 companies owning 17% of the nation's theaters is enough to call it a monopoly under the Sherman Act. For reference, the Sherman Act is the landmark 1890 federal law that says you can't rig a market so nobody else can compete. In 1951, the court issues a new set of rules. Every unfair practice the Supreme Court killed stays dead. Studios sell films one at a time and license to any qualified theater on equal terms. If a studio gives one theater the exclusive right to show a film in a given area, that exclusivity expires after 90 days. But the buildings themselves, the palaces and the chains and the land underneath them, remain studio property. The new rules save the system, but they can't save a company run by Howard Hughes. His management of RKO is so chaotic that by 1953, a manager assigned by the court is running the theater chain because Hughes won't answer his own phone. So in 1955, he sells the whole operation, studio and theaters and all, to Paramount's Barney Balaban. The RKO name goes dark. Their Culver City studio lot becomes a Paramount facility. And Paramount becomes the largest theater chain in the United States, with locations in every major city where new movies open first. Paramount gets bigger by absorbing a dead competitor. MGM doesn't need to absorb anyone. Lowe's, the crown jewel of the theater business, stays connected to MGM, the production lot that produces more stars per square foot than any facility in Hollywood. The 3-hour reserved seat epic with an intermission in the middle, which is what the industry calls a roadshow picture, thrives because MGM owns the palatial downtown theaters built to show them. Ben-Hur opens in a Lowe's Palace in 1959. 6 years later, Dr. Zhivago opens in another one. The roadshow model keeps going into the mid-1970s because the company that makes the spectacles owns the rooms designed for them. Warner Brothers keeps its East Coast chain and uses the screens to push its own films. Fox's West Coast theaters, combined with the new widescreen format CinemaScope and Daryl Zanuck's appetite for widescreen spectacle, make it the biggest theater owner west of the Mississippi. But the ripple goes beyond major studios. The ban on block booking changes the economics for independent filmmakers. Studios can no longer fill their own screens with garbage bundled alongside hits. Every film has to earn its slot on individual merit, and the new rules require studios to offer the same deal to any theater that wants to book the film. An independent producer with a good enough movie can negotiate for a showing at a Paramount-owned theater on the same terms Paramount offers its own films. The gates aren't locked anymore. They're harder to open from the outside, but they can still be opened. The same stability that lets the studios hold their theaters lets them hold on to their actors too. A California court ruling from 1944 already capped exclusive deals at 7 years, and the 1960 Screen Actors Guild strike forces studios to add a cut of the profits and payments every time a film airs on television. But stable theater revenue means the studios can afford to offer contract terms that talent actually wants. Through the mid-1960s, major stars work for one company at a time, at salaries that would have been unimaginable 2 decades earlier. The freelance model that we know, where an actor shoots for Paramount in January and Universal in June, takes another decade to become normal. And all of this runs on theater revenue. But theater revenue is falling. Weekly moviegoing drops from 90 million to 40 million by 1960 because families are buying TV sets and moving to the suburbs where there's no downtown palace on every corner. The studios can't stop any of that. What the theaters give them is a floor. Revenue from owned screens, even half-full ones, that pays the overhead and keeps the production lots running. So studios don't fire their actors in 1953. They don't dump their film libraries to television networks out of desperation, like they did in our timeline. They license slowly, reluctantly, and on their own terms. And when the audience moves to the suburbs, the studios follow. Paramount and Fox build multiplexes and shopping malls, placing their own screens where the families have gone. By the mid-1970s, the Big Four, Paramount with the absorbed RKO chain, MGM, Lowe's, Warner, and Fox, operate 2 tiers of theaters. The old downtown palaces for their biggest films and roadshow events, and suburban multiplexes for everything else. Independent theaters survive, but the prime suburban locations belong to the studios. By the late 1960s, the Big Four have weathered the television exodus, they've kept their theaters, and they've maintained the infrastructure of the old system. But they're not exactly thriving. The lists of actors under exclusive contract are thinning. The roadshow model is starting to tire. But they're solvent. And solvent is the word that changes everything that comes next. A generation of young directors trained in film schools and obsessed with European and Japanese directors like Goddard, Fellini, and Kurosawa shows up at the studio gates wanting to make movies that look nothing like what the studios have been producing for the past 30 years. Now, the executives listen. They're not stupid. They know the audience is changing, but they're not desperate. And a desperate executive and a solvent executive are two completely different animals. A desperate executive hands $1 million budget to a 27-year-old and says, "Here, go make whatever you want." A solvent executive says, "We like your idea. Here are our notes." But the Big Four aren't the only game in town. Columbia and Universal never own theaters in any timeline. Their business is making films and getting them into theaters the other companies own. And the ban on block booking actually helps them because the Big Four can't fill every screen with their own bundled product. Open slots need filling. Columbia and Universal are filling them. That's where most of the next generation of directors start their careers, and that path doesn't change here. Francis Ford Coppola walks into Paramount in 1969 to pitch an adaptation of Mario Puzo's best-selling novel about the Italian mafia. Paramount wants a hit. A novel that big is impossible to ignore. But Coppola walks into a studio that has a few things going for it that didn't exist in the real timeline. Money in the bank, guaranteed screens waiting for the finished product, and a list of directors who could take the job if he turns it down. He wants a specific actor for the lead. He wants to shoot on location in New York instead of on a cheaper studio lot. He wants a dark, operatic tone that the executives aren't comfortable with. Paramount gives him the picture and about half of what he's asking for on everything else. The Godfather opens big, makes money, and earns solid reviews. But nobody calls it the greatest American film ever made. George Lucas finds a home at Fox, which is the company most willing to bet on spectacle because Darryl Zanuck spent 20 years betting on spectacle and Fox has the screens to show it off. Star Wars opens on May 25th, 1977. Fox collects every dollar of ticket revenue through its own theaters. Lucas, who took a lower director's fee in exchange for sequel and merchandising rights, discovers that Fox will let him keep the merchandise because plastic action figures are not worth fighting over in 1977, but has no intention of surrendering the follow-up to the biggest hit the company has ever produced. Lucas keeps the toys. He loses The Empire Strikes Back. The sequel is a Fox production made on Fox's terms, released in Fox's theaters. Another young director is a little too eccentric for the big studios. Martin Scorsese makes his career through Columbia, the one major company that makes and distributes films, but owns no theaters and has no guaranteed revenue to protect. Columbia takes chances on material the Big Four won't touch. Mean Streets gets made, and so does Taxi Driver. They find audiences in the independent theaters that the new rules force the studios to share screens with, and in the small independent theaters that show foreign and experimental films which have been growing in college towns since the 1950s. Now you might be wondering right now, but Kevin, what about Steven Spielberg and his Mexican non-union equivalent, Señor Spielbergo? Well, Steven Spielberg thrives. Señor Spielbergo, unfortunately, doesn't exist. I'm sorry about that. But Spielberg was always the most commercially instinctive filmmaker of that group, and a system that rewards commercial instincts rewards Spielberg. Jaws opens in the summer of 1975, and the blockbuster arrives right on schedule. So the talent is identical. The films are well crafted and sometimes very good. But what's missing is the freedom that comes from having no executives to say no. The studios kept their gates, kept their screens, and kept the keys. And the directors who showed up in the late 1960s and early 1970s got hired. But they didn't get to remake the industry. In 1972, a cable startup called Home Box Office starts offering movies in living rooms. HBO needs studio films to fill its schedule, and the studios, with profitable theater chains and no interest in sending movies to living rooms any faster than necessary, make HBO pay dearly for every minute of licensed content. HBO, unable to build a subscriber base on overpriced studio films, starts making its own. Original TV movies in the early 1980s, original series by the mid-1980s. The company that wanted to be a movie channel becomes a production studio because the production studios won't cooperate. 15 years before anyone else realizes that original programming is the future of cable television, HBO figures it out by accident because nobody will sell it what it actually wants. But American households now have additional choices at home. Betamax shows up in 1975, VHS arrives in the early 1980s, and studios with owned theaters enforce a 5-month gap between a movie's theater run and the day it shows up on tape. Because of this change, the video rental market grows much more slowly. The theatrical experience remains the default way Americans watch movies well into the 1990s. And studios set that gap because they profit from every week the film stays on their own screens, and nobody has the leverage to force a shorter window. The studios, as owners of both the production lots and the suburban multiplexes, control the full experience of going to the movies. They decide what opens, when it opens, and how long it runs. A Paramount picture opens at a Paramount multiplex and plays as long as Paramount says it plays. When blockbusters start requiring wider releases in the 1970s and early 1980s, the Big Four open films on their own screens first and expand to independent theaters after the opening weekend rush. That 4-month gap holds for as long as the only way to watch a movie at home involves driving to a rental store. Enter Netflix. Netflix launches as a DVD by mail service in 1997, and the DVD business works the same way it always would have. But streaming changes everything. When Netflix starts offering movies over the internet in 2007, the studios refuse to license their libraries at any price worth paying. Sending movies to a box in the living room threatens ticket sales at their own theaters, and every studio executive in America understands that equation. Netflix founder and CEO Reed Hastings, now locked out of the studio vaults, starts building original content in 2008, hiring writers and producers and constructing a production operation from scratch. Netflix becomes the 21st century version of United Artists, a company built for creators who can't get through the studio gates. By 2015, Netflix is producing more original content than some of the traditional studios. The company that couldn't license other people's movies has become a factory for its own, spending billions of dollars a year on shows and films that skip theaters entirely. For the first time since the 1940s, a company outside the Big Four has the ability to make enough content to compete with them. The difference is that Netflix screen is a laptop, not a palace. In December 2025, Netflix announces a deal that it's acquiring Warner Brothers for $82 billion. Warner's theater chain is part of that deal, and now a streaming platform with 300 million subscribers is about to own the studio, the film library, and the seats. The company that started as a DVD by mail service in Los Gatos is assembling the same top-to-bottom monopoly that 5 Hollywood studios built in the 1920s and the Supreme Court tried to dismantle in 1948. A senator at a 2026 hearing holds up a copy of the 1948 opinion. She reads the line Justice Douglas wrote 78 years earlier, that owning the whole pipeline, from making movies to showing them, isn't illegal by itself, and asks Netflix co-CEO Ted Sarandos how Douglas would feel about a company that controls the content, the platform, and the theaters. Sarandos doesn't have a good answer, but really, nobody does. The question the Paramount case tried to settle in 1948 is back, but rewritten for fiber optics and monthly subscriptions. And nobody in Washington knows what to do with it, because the last time it came up, a bored billionaire in a Beverly Hills bungalow made it disappear before the court could finish asking. Howard Hughes didn't care about movies. He cared about airplanes and TWA and microscopic germs and honestly, whatever had his attention on any given Tuesday. He bought RKO because he could. He was kind of the Elon Musk of his day. And he ran it into the ground because he couldn't help himself. Again, he was like the Elon Musk of his day. And he signed the agreement because fighting for a movie studio was never going to be the most interesting thing on Howard Hughes' to-do list. His indifference was the first domino. Hughes signed, Paramount followed, Warner fell in line, and within a decade, the system that had run American movie making since the 1920s was gone. And what came next was the thing nobody planned for. About 10 years where the old guard had lost control and the new corporate Hollywood hadn't figured itself out. And in that gap, a generation of directors made The Godfather and Chinatown and Jaws and Taxi Driver and Star Wars and Apocalypse Now and Annie Hall. Every one of those films exists because the studios had lost their grip on the screen. And the studios lost their grip because Howard Hughes, a man who couldn't be bothered to read his own company's scripts, also couldn't be bothered to fight for his own company's theaters. The most consequential decision in Hollywood history was made by the one person in the room who wasn't thinking about Hollywood. In the Control-Z timeline, Hughes holds, and that gap never opens. The directors are just as talented, the films are just as well crafted, but none of them are made with the freedom that turned good movies into the ones we're still talking about 50 years later. We got the better timeline, but we got it because Howard Hughes was bored. Decisions don't get do-overs, but on this show they do. If you like the show, please rate and subscribe wherever you happen to be listening. It helps other people find the show and allows me to understand whether people actually enjoy this. Until next time, I'm Kevin Perez Allen. Thanks for hitting Control-Z with me.